District of Conservation is sponsored by the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, better known as CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thanks for listening to the program.
Hey there, Ryan Reynolds here. It's a new year, and you know what that means. No, not the diet. Resolutions. A way for us all to try and do a little bit better than we did last year. And my resolution, unlike big wireless, is to not be a raging and raise the price of wireless on you every chance I get. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited. See mintmobile.com for details.
Auto insurance can all seem the same until it comes time to use it. So don't get stuck paying more for less coverage. Switch to USAA Auto Insurance and you could start saving money in no time. Get a quote today. Restrictions apply.
Welcome to District of Conservation. I'm your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. Welcome to the first District of Conservation episode of 2025. If you're a new listener, I'm Gabriella Hoffman. I'm the longtime host of this program. We're now in our 7th season. It's incredible what gains we've had, all the guests we've had on the program, and we're not stopping anytime soon. With it being the start of the 119th congressional session, Winter Storm Blair pummeling our region, I will let you know how many inches of snow we get and maybe some of the wildlife that might traverse my backyard. It's always a good time filming wildlife whenever there's a snowstorm. Might be successful in that endeavor. And of course, I can't forget to mention and briefly discuss the American bald eagle officially being dubbed our national bird. I thought that was a very interesting story that deserves some coverage, so I'm going to try to detangle all of these topics for you today. Ahead of the new year, outgoing President Biden signed a law into act officially dubbing the American bald eagle the official national bird. This is many decades, if not hundreds of years, several centuries in the making. America's founding fathers had approved the Great Seal, as it's called, in 1782, which now bears the likeness and symbol, the American bald eagle, that a lot of Americans and even naturalized Americans and visitors to America are very familiar with. You can't come to America or think of America without thinking the American bald eagle. This bicameral bipartisan law that passed and cruised through both the House and the Senate essentially is going to amend and did amend Title 37 of the U.S. Code, which now says that the American bald eagle is officially our bird. There was actually a lot of controversy, and I documented this at Town Hall, which you can read in the show notes if you're curious about the history and back and forth. But there was debate even among some of our founding fathers, Ben Franklin in particular, and maybe this is where this 240 some odd year gap originates from. There was debate over the bald eagle being labeled the national bird, if it really merited the title, if it truly deserved to have this honor. I'm in the camp that believes that it should be America's bird because I don't think a wild turkey, while it is native to the United States, it's not that same kind of regal quality. It doesn't have that same regal quality and majestic quality that an American bald eagle does. I know some friends of mine listening might disagree with me, but I just think the eagle is far superior to the turkey. Turkeys are beautiful. If you look at some of their plumage, especially those in Florida, gorgeous. But overall, I think the eagle rightly beats out the turkey. Here's what Ben Franklin had to say reportedly about turkeys versus bald eagles, and I thought it was kind of funny in this. So he wrote in a letter that in truth, the turkey is in comparison a much more respectable bird and withal a true original native of America. He further bemoaned the eagle in this letter, and I'm reading from the column I wrote, adding, "It is a bird of bad moral character. He does not get his living honestly. He is too lazy to fish for himself." Although I have seen eagles fish for themselves. If you go to Alaska, you could see this happening. I see this here in the Potomac River all the time, all the nests that you see here. And why does it matter, I'd say in the greater context of politics, policy, why is this important? Why now? Does this impact you, the taxpayer? No, I don't think it's negative in terms of effects on taxpayers. It shouldn't cost us anything. We shouldn't see this, but these symbolic gestures occur all the time. They might seem very trivial, But I think in terms of the bald eagle's status and everyone knowing it, whether it being a notorious bird or a famous bird, however you view the eagle, and some people in some corners of the United States view the eagle as a pest because they are very predatory. They eat a lot of fish. And there's some debate over, do you give them enough grace? But even with this designation and with their amazing comeback, of course, it is still federally protected. You should never harm a bald eagle. If you rescue one, send it to the appropriate center. But we really balk at in this country, rightfully so. I talked about how in winter 2023, a couple of illegal immigrants from Guatemala had shot and cooked a bald eagle. And the Fish and Wildlife Service, we talked about this here. We had Congressman Mike Flood of Nebraska, where this atrocious act took place, his district, to talk about how egregious and terrible this act was, of course, violating various different laws, the Migratory Bird Act, and some other laws that protect eagles, and how Biden's Fish and Wildlife Service turned a blind eye to the incident until there was a lot of outrage, and they finally had to be like, okay, we're going to not turn a blind eye to this and prosecute, help investigate, and work with law enforcement to prosecute the people, the perpetrators who committed this egregious act. But otherwise, you really don't see, outside of some occasional unfortunate poaching that does happen of eagles, any blatant disrespect, because I think we have a culture now in this country, again, respecting the bird because it's a symbol, it's in our emblem. Now it's our official national bird. So I bet even the repercussions of enacting any harm on the eagle will even carry more serious weight because it is officially the national bird. I'm not sure what the penalties will look like in that regard, and that's above the pale for this type of podcast. But the bald eagle is successfully recovered. A lot of people were kind of poo-pooing the bird status, and we often hear all the time, we saw this under this administration, that continued lead usage for hunting and fishing activity, especially on federal public lands, would further imperil or once again imperil the bald eagle. I think most hunters and anglers, myself included, are very cognizant of not leaving any trace behind. There's that whole campaign. It's a nice social media influencer marketing campaign to encourage people to not leave waste, and that includes even leaving lead bullets and tackle. And nobody tries to deliberately leave lead so bald eagles, birds of prey, other animals specifically or intentionally ingest it. The people who leave it behind are usually very careless and they don't call themselves conservationists, but I would say most conservationists, including hunters and anglers, do not leave these materials behind intentionally and want to remove it from the areas that they've hunted, fished, shot guns at, because you have to leave the place better than you found it. That's just a thing we're programmed to believe if you go in the great outdoors. That's what a lot of these so-called bird conservationists, a lot of them who might be well-intended, but sometimes can be a detriment to the causes that they're advocating for. They're kind of hypocritical because they love to monopolize advocacy of bald eagles and say, well, if you engage in this behavior, hunting, fishing, you can't support bald eagles. There are multiple people who support the bald eagle, whether they hunt or not. It doesn't mean you're going to hunt the bald eagle yourself. I don't think anyone in hunting or fishing supports the harvesting of bald eagles. I don't, because it's federally protected. But there's always that to worry about. And I remember growing up in Southern California, they always had these kind of doomsday predictions that eagles are never bouncing back. And granted, I lived in California, even in the red dot in the blue of sea, the more conservative region in Orange County, and the schools were still feeding us this information that eagles never bounce back. I moved to Virginia as an adult. I've lived here for almost 13 years. I can't go outside my house going on nearby hikes in the region, my corner of Northern Virginia that I live in, and not see a bald eagle or some bird of prey for that matter. We have so many eagles' nests. I've even seen eagles as recent as around the Christmas holiday in Old Town Alexandria. I saw one that built a nest in front of what used to be the old Ford Motor Company factory in Old Town Alexandria, believe it or not. Of course, I had to document the experience. It's on my social media if you're curious to see that. It was a little before Christmas. But bald eagles have made a very impressive comeback. And I talked about this in the town hall column too, saying in the most recent survey of total eagle populations in the lower 48, the 2020 update, there are now over 316,000 individual birds with 71,400 nesting pairs. It's quadruple the amount that was last documented in 2009 when there were 72,000 plus individuals and 30 some odd thousand breeding pairs recorded in the lower 48. So that's quadruple the number if you extrapolate that. Amazing, impressive comeback. I don't think anyone wants to see the bird further imperiled, which is why educational efforts have long been enacted to ensure that we don't harm them and that we see their populations continue to soar. And this national bird designation, I think, is going to add to that and add to that kind of culture of respecting this bird. And I know some of you turkey lovers are disappointed, but it's okay. I think you'll come around to supporting this gesture, this declaration. Not the worst thing Congress could do, nor a lame duck president, which I've been very critical of, which is why I think transitioning into the 119th Congress and this soon anticipated inauguration of Trump 2.0 is very interesting. We started this podcast, for those of you who are new to the program, I started this midway through the first Trump administration, not because I wanted to propagandize. I'm a conservative Republican, and when people listen and they read my commentary, they think I'm always a shoo-in for agreeing with everything Trump says. I think I agree with him a lot of the time. There are some areas which I've talked about going into the second administration. I disagree with this proposal to make freedom cities on federal lands, and I think I've heard chatter that that is not going to be pursued given the slim majority in the House of Representatives. Also, why would you be wanting to sell public lands? It's not a popular position, even among Republicans. The middle ground here is pursuing a true multiple use management agenda. But I digress there. We're going to talk more about this, of course, as the weeks and months advance. But I want to talk briefly about my observations going into the 119th Congress, what we can expect. You'll see this documented through my work at IWF, our C4 outfit, IW Voice. I will be involved in the legislative battles there, and will also be interacting with agencies in my professional capacity. And I think outside of my professional capacity, I would love to sit down with some of the new cabinet members, newly elected or returning members of Congress, some of the chairs of the committees. I think I want to dedicate this section about the 119th Congress, laying out what the dynamics are, discussing some of the returning or new chairs across both the House and Senate, and what I think some of the priorities and bills we're going to see, maybe in the short term, perhaps the long term. Let's start with the House of Representatives. So there's maybe a few seat majority in the House of Representatives. That majority is largely in support of incoming President Trump's agenda, which is unleashing domestic energy that is reliable, preferably oil and gas, but also coal, nuclear, geothermal, perhaps hydropower, and this moving away from solar and wind. That's what you're going to see across both the House and the Senate. Also with this repealing of different executive orders that is expected once Trump assumes office again, January 20th, January 21st. That first week, we'll see a lot of undoing of bad Biden policies. And you're going to see that support perhaps codified in forthcoming reconciliation bills. We keep hearing this talk of one reconciliation bill, which includes some energy provisions, maybe two reconciliation bills that include some splattering of energy provisions as well. But a lot of the legwork to undo bad Biden-Harris era policies will come within the first couple of weeks, with a lot of the stuff being undone by executive orders because they were enacted by executive orders. So you'll kind of see that undoing there. You probably will see a permanent codifying of good measures to kind of bring certain laws, long-standing laws that are misused, not enforced, or used to stymie domestic oil gas production in particular. So you may see Congress, again, through this notion of a reconciliation bill, pass some things within the first 100 days, I've been reliably informed, in some form of a reconciliation package. And as those details come in, I will try to bring those to you here on the program. But who is going to be administering from both the House and the Senate side, leading the efforts for these bills? And can we expect these Republicans to fully move away from net zero and even subsidize solar and wind? Because there is a tendency, even among some Republicans, like Democrats, to support unreliable energy because it just sounds attractive and their districts may be getting some federal money in doing so. So Republicans even have to be held accountable. But I think with who's leading these various different committees, and we're starting the House, talk then about the Senate, who's going to be helming energy and natural resources related committees. And there's lots of subcommittees. I'm not going to bore you with those details. You can see for yourself, very searchable, readable, easy information to find if you're curious to see like what the subcommittees are. But thinking big picture, what these committees are going to be tasked with, and I think even some caucuses too. I think it's important to talk about the caucuses, the Western Caucus in particular, that works in sync with both energy and natural resources committees. Natural resources, House Natural Resources, is still being helmed by Congressman Bruce Westerman of Arkansas. We've had him on the program. We love bringing him onto the program to talk about what is going on. He's been very gracious with his time. I think I've had him on 3 times. I interact with his staff pretty frequently in my professional capacity, and I have talked to the congressman on a few occasions at events and things of that sort, and through interviews, of course. And so we think he has a pretty good head on his shoulders. I'm not worried about any pieces of legislation that are worrisome that will be coming from him. And he's a sportsman. So for the sportsman listening to the show, he's not just going to be greenlighting good energy bills as it relates to federal lands. He's also going to be advocating pro-sportsmen's bills. So hunters and anglers will feel very represented under another chairmanship in the House Natural Resources Committee by Bruce Westerman. If there's anything that's alarming or concerning, I don't have any worries with him so much. We'll bring that to the table. But largely under his chairmanship and leadership, we have seen a lot of good legislation promoted. I hope across both the House and the Senate, this is just my private wish list, but kind of like what I feel would be good, and maybe there's an appetite for this, but we need to see Congress tackle, rather, Antiquities Act reforms, permitting reform, so many big picture things, NEPA reform, reforming the Endangered Species Act, these things that are not very sexy. But I think there will be an appetite now that we have a trifecta to see this happen. So I know he's going to push forward some notion of NEPA reform, Antiquities Act reform, ESA reform, as they have done. And a committee, or rather a caucus that works in concert with that, as I mentioned, is the Western Caucus. I've done a lot with the Western Caucus in my professional capacity as well. It is chaired by California Congressman Doug LaMalfa, who I've interacted with before. My sister, when she worked for Congress, interacted with him. I've had great interactions with him, so I look forward to seeing what him and his staff come up with. But new to Energy and Commerce, which is the longest committee in Congress since almost the very beginning, is now helmed not by Kathy McMorris Rodgers since she retired from Congress, but she had a lot of good pieces of legislation. She did a lot to fight Biden's directives on household appliances and war on domestic energy. Now it's being led by Kentucky Congressman Brett Guthrie, and I'm not very familiar with him. I don't know if I've had interactions with him in the past. There are over 400 some odd House of Representative members, 435. So it's impossible to interact with every single person, but I'm looking forward to seeing what he does in his capacity as Energy and Commerce Committee. That's a very important committee. They will ensure that Department of Energy, EPA don't go out of bounds. And I think they'll work in concert with the Trump administration to ensure that no questionable rules or no heavy-handed rules, especially leftover rules, emboldening net zero, all these kind of climate directives that really had no bearing on emissions reductions. They were just very costly, and they didn't do anything to bolster the environment. That's what these climate directives typically do. They promise great things, but they actually don't reduce emissions, and they don't lead to a better environment in terms of incentives. And they just enact costs and pain and red tape onto people and businesses. So we'll probably see synergy between the committee and the agencies more, where hopefully no holdover individuals from this administration are obstructing progress. And we'll probably see, again, some maybe codifying or reforming of laws, especially relating to energy conservation standards for household appliances, making sure that any fraud, waste, and abuse with these last-minute kind of midnight orders from Biden in terms of DOE loans, forthcoming future Solyndras. There were a lot of very questionable green energy projects because of the Inflation Reduction Act that are going kaput. They never came online, and they just wasted taxpayer money or enriched rich benefactors who were beneficiaries of the IRA, other big spending measures. So we'll probably see a lot of accountability for certain stopgap spending measures, bills. So we can expect some oversight perhaps from E&C, natural resources, to happen as well. And on the Senate side, we have Senator Cynthia Lummis leading the Western Caucus, Senate Western Caucus. I've engaged with her. And again, the caucus works very closely with the Energy and Natural Resources committees to ensure that Western perspectives have a voice. And they've even extended in both the House and the Senate to have members who don't even represent the West, but just kind of expand it to represent rural, sportsmen, forester, rancher, farmer interests that are kind of often ignored. On the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, we have Senator Mike Lee of Utah now helming that committee. It's a very important committee. Senator Lee often attracts a lot of criticism for some of his stances regarding public lands. We have some disagreements. I've had him on the show before, but even with those disagreements, I think he will be a very interesting chairman. I don't think he's going to be successful with some of the stuff he wants to do to deputize or redeputize public lands back to the states. We may see that discussed. It's a very popular online conversation, but if you're worried about any selling of public lands, it's not going to happen. There may be debate over it, but you're not going to see that. And I don't agree, as I've talked about before, opening up federal lands to affordable housing. I think it's a gateway to bad policy. We don't need to see that. We just need to see kind of this return to the middle of multiple use management where these federal agencies are not trampling on people's rights, closing down access like we saw under this administration. Senator Lee is a very sharp guy, so I think he will chair the committee in a very interesting way. We may not always agree. I think I'll agree more than the previous chairman when Manchin led it, although he wasn't as extreme as I thought he would be, but he was the deciding vote for the IRA. Very lamentable. Compared to other Democrats, maybe he is the more preferable, rather, choice to helmet, ENR. But I think I'll largely agree with what Senator Lee's priorities are. And again, there might be some differences with respect to public lands. I understand the Utah position because they've been slighted. And a lot of people don't like the mismanagement of public lands, which is a legitimate position. I'm very critical of that too, because we see these past 4 years in particular, that BLM and the wider Department of Interior, Fish and Wildlife Service, DOE, Forest Service, all were focused on these ESG climate directives priorities over wildlife management, over forest management, over fulfilling their mission statements. And then you saw backlogs. You saw even $9 billion added to the maintenance backlog of national parks. President Biden's administration couldn't even handle reducing the backlog of national parks. He claims to be for the environment, couldn't even fulfill that. Not surprising. We've talked about this at length here on the program. I'm not going to ruminate about the past. But even conservation suffered with these heavy-handed top-down directives like the America the Beautiful, aka 30 by 30 initiative, which doesn't define conservation and ultimately ruins the meaning and kind of sullies the meaning of conservation with these national monument, carte blanche national monument designations with no input from people who would be affected by those monument designations, but it was just a bypassing of that, fulfilling a lot of environmental backers. And then you saw closures of millions of acres to recreational shooting, hunting, fishing, and the like all over the United States, lower 48 and Alaska too. We saw the Alaska Subsistence Board close 60 million acres to caribou hunting. You might not think that's important, but that's a very big slap in the face to public lands access. It was very controversial. So we're not going to see a closure of federal lands, and I think there's going to be, again, more oversight overall, and we're going to see that support channeled, again, through Senator Mike Lee, the Western Caucus, and lest I forget, the new chair of the Environment and Public Works Committee. So this is kind of like ENC, the equivalent of Environment and Commerce, but it's going to be helmed by Shelley Moore Capito, who is a West Virginia senator, and she's been pretty good on these issues too, for the most part. I haven't really seen anything questionable. She's not really into the climate nonsense like some other Republicans, a handful of Republicans might be. But EPW is a very important committee, and is tasked with a very similar responsibility like ENC on the House side. So it's very interesting to see her take the helm of the committee and what she will prioritize, perhaps working in concert with the House to pass either standalone bills or get this big reconciliation package we keep hearing about, which includes energy provisions, allegedly. I will find out more, even in my professional capacity, what that looks like and report back to you here. But like I said, the first 100 days, now that you know who is helming these committees, is going to be really interesting. I was told ahead of time that energy is going to be a priority. So I'm trying to figure out what tangible goals and accomplishments will look like in my professional setting as IWF Center for Energy and Conservation Director, what that looks like. How do you measure success, especially not only from Congress, but even the agency side. But I think a lot of the work is going to be done when you see just the executive orders being repealed, but there will be some efforts to ensure that beyond that, things like the Inflation Reduction Act are defanged. Any household appliance regulation also hopefully repealed or removed. We're going to see this emphasis on deregulation, which I know scares people. It sounds very scary. You think, okay, waters of the United States is going to be defanged. especially in wake of that big Supreme Court ruling from a few years ago, Sackett versus EPA, that says that you can't essentially deem waters navigable, a pond or a trickle or things of that. Not everything's a navigable water. You have to clarify what that means, which was a win. I know some of my friends in the duck hunting world might disagree, but there's no effect to wetlands. It's just to ensure that not every body of water that is non-contiguous is not labeled a navigable water. I think that's a reasonable standard. You're going to see household appliance rules peeled back, ensuring that 30 by 30 does not become official law, getting us out of the Paris Climate Accords. You'll see, hopefully, the 119th Congress tackling that and ensuring that there's no volleying back and forth between administrations. If one day a Democrat would come back to the office of the president and put us back into the really ineffective Paris Climate Accord. So we're going to see a lot of offensive gestures to really hit the ground running to unleash domestic energy production. We'll probably see lawsuits from environmentalists to block Trump's agenda, unfortunately. We'll see Congress try to pass things. Will we see some Democrats come on board, Republican-led efforts, knowing that the math is not in Democrats' favor? We may be able to appeal a few moderates to vote. I think I'm thinking conservative movement, but I think you will see some Democrats in these very swingy districts say, okay, I don't have to be worried about being a moderate. I actually don't agree with all this climate stuff that my colleagues pushed or these radical anti-hunting measures, so I'm going to vote with Republicans. We may see that. We may see some negotiating and true bipartisan efforts in that manner. If I am able to bring on any of these aforementioned chairmen, I will. I would love to sit down with them, have a casual conversation about what they're up to, what people need to know about their committees, their priorities, what things look like if they're actually serving the public, if they're serving conservationists, energy producers, hunters, anglers, ranchers, foresters, everyone that kind of fits into the framework of conservation. And so I look forward to having, conversations with key players in Washington here on this format like we have in the past. It's going to be an exciting 2 years of this 119th congressional session. It's going to be fun to have kind of a front seat into this now as someone working in policy, not so much freelance media. So follow along for the ride. Stay tuned for forthcoming interviews as they come and policy discussions that are going to trickle from Washington, D.C., these different agencies, and all around the country, because it's not just what's happening here in D.C. that matters. I also think discussing what's happening in states, especially blue states, which unsurprisingly target sportsmen and energy efforts, seeing what they're doing, talking to people on the ground there as a kind of clarion call and warning sign as to what not to do. We are also not going to neglect to do that as we enter this new year, 2025. If you're in the path of Winter Storm Blair like I am, I hope you stay safe, have enough fuel, resources, get those shovels ready, and don't listen to the naysayers who are going to attribute this to climate change or the so-called climate crisis. This is winter. This is to be expected. We have had anticipation of this storm for a very long time, a week now. So please be safe. Have some fun in the snow. I'm going to try to do my best. Like I said, I want to see if there's any wildlife I can capture on film. Playing in the snow, some surprises. We'll see what happens there. I'm going to bring up my vortex spotting scope. I got a new phone scope attachment to better record on my iPhone any wildlife I might see or birds that I may come across in my backyard. Follow on social media and you can see if I'm successful in that quest. But stay safe, stay warm, and exciting times ahead in conservation policy. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this installment of District of Conservation, I would love to know your feedback. Send it my way. Please be sure to leave us reviews on Apple, Spotify, or wherever podcasts are played, and also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to never miss a beat nor a guest announcement. Thanks so much for listening to District of Conservation. I hope you have a wonderful day, and please share the podcast to those who may be interested in learning more about these critical natural resources, environment, energy issues.